Thank you, everyone. My name is Jenny Leestma. I'm a PhD student in robotics at Georgia Tech, and this is work that I did with Viv Iyer, who's a rockstar undergraduate student in our lab, as well as my co-advisors Aaron Young and Greg Zwicky. So broadly, the goal in our lab is we're trying to work towards intelligent, continuous exoskeleton control, and a lot of the times we're thinking about this from a high-level control perspective, where we're estimating states of the individual or of the environment. And we tend to take a very data-driven approach where we collect large multimodal data sets and use machine learning to extract real-time biomechanical outcomes that we can then use to inform exoskeleton control. So the specific goal of my dissertation is to work on balance augmenting exoskeletons. So we're thinking a lot about high-level control states like balance metrics, step placement, center of mass mechanics, and such. So in the first study that we did, we were looking to gain a really diverse array of kind of destabilizing scenarios during perturbed walking experiments. And so we used the system that we have. It's an instrumented treadmill mounted in a 6 degrees freedom Stewart platform. And we varied the perturbations in 3 magnitudes, 8 directions, and 4 gait cycle onset times that we targeted using a closed loop controller. So we did these 96 conditions 3 times per our 11 participants. So we had just over 3,000 perturbations in this data set. But what we noticed when we were collecting this data is kind of an interesting recovery strategy that we weren't expecting. So when we perturbed people with the right timing and direction, we induced a limb collision strategy that caused people to jump a lot of the time. We noticed this because of an absence of any vertical ground reaction force during a few of our trials. So this spun off a fun biomechanics side project to kind of look into this. Originally, we were not expecting that these jumps were going to be a major part of the data set. So like I said, we had just over 3,000 perturbations. And there were only 27 jumps, or just under 1% of the trials in this data set where people lost ground contact. But when we looked a little bit closer, it was only occurring in 8 of the 96 conditions. And if we look a little bit closer at these conditions, with red being where the jumps happened, some of these conditions were eliciting jumps in 10 to 30% of the responses across all of our participants. So it seemed like this wasn't kind of a one-off edge case that we could ignore in our data set, and something that we actually wanted to look into a little bit more to consider possibly in future exoskeleton control paradigms. So what we noticed the commonality in all of these conditions is it was inducing a crossover step in the step after the perturbation occurred, and it was kind of perfectly targeting a crossover step where the swing leg was going to come into collision with the stance leg that was on the ground. So as we were thinking about how exoskeletons should handle this, we started talking to our neighboring bipedal robotics lab and about kind of how they handle these situations and the swing foot path planning that they might consider. And they hadn't thought about it directly, so we put Cassie on Karen, gave this a try, and it turns out Cassie also did not have a way to compensate for this. So this has led to a fun collaboration where we're kind of trying to learn from humans and robots together. So why would this cause a jump? Like I said, we think this is a swing and stance limb collision kind of obstacle that people are facing, and it's an interesting recovery strategy to think about because in comparison to perturbed walking experiments where people are stumbling on a block, this is actually you're stumbling on something that's also directly influencing your recovery strategy and not just an external independent obstacle that you can avoid. So the way that we quantified this was we looked at step width and step length. And you can see here with the stance foot, all these light gray paths are this path of the swing foot heel during normal typical steps. And this is what kind of the path looked like for all of the feet leading up to a jump. So what we did to detect the possible collision or actual collision was looked at the instantaneous velocity vector of the swing foot approaching the jump to see if it would collide with the stance foot. Then we also saw some interesting strategies for how people executed these jumps that I'll go over very quickly. So we saw a foot replacement strategy where if you're on your stance limb, the aerial phase happened, they went up, and they came down basically with the opposite limb in the exact same location as their foot, or at least an overlapping location. We saw a leap strategy, which is more of a conventional step, so they were on their stance foot, went into the aerial phase and came down in more of a typical step placement pattern. And then we also saw a lateral skip, where people were on their stance foot, came up, came back down on that same foot, but a little bit further laterally, which kind of turns a narrowing step into a widening step. So now that we have kind of our initial hypotheses formed about why this might happen, we went back into the lab to collect some more data. Did this a couple weeks ago and was ambitious about how much I could get processed before this conference. But we basically did 50% jump-inducing conditions and 50% everything else that originally did not cause jumps in this data set. And you can see here that we're able to kind of enforce this crossover step strategy that makes the individual's limbs collide. So, did people jump? This was actually a very interesting finding. Yes and no. So we saw a lot of participant-dependent strategies. Some participants were jumping over 50% of the time in response to those conditions. Some did not jump at all. So we can see these are the 4 target conditions that we looked at that were inducing jump strategies. And we can see anywhere from 5 to 20% across all participants, which is definitely lower than we were expecting given the numbers that we saw in the first study. So we think there might be some adaptation or acclimation happening during this study. So what did they do instead? So if you remember this foot replacement strategy I just mentioned, where there was an aerial phase between these 2 feet coming down, what we saw is what I'll call a step foot replacement strategy, where they were on their stance limb and their other limb came down and stepped immediately behind, and then they propelled into the next step, but this was in the absence of an aerial phase. But kinematically, these 2 strategies look very similar. So if we look at the number of times that happened, depending on condition, we got up to 50% across all participants where that was the strategy that they were executing. So again, I'll play this video one more time because that's the strategy that I showed here. So you can see crossover step, they put their swing foot down behind their stance foot and continue on. So some other strategies we observed during this kind of targeted jump study were exaggerated foot crossovers, where they were kind of exaggerating, elevating their swing foot to get over their stance foot, stance hip abduction, and stance time modulation. I see the ears going off, so I gotta wrap up. But we're starting to look at the swing path in both the transverse and sagittal plane across conditions, and we do see a lot of subject consistency in the way that they execute these strategies. So I will have this on my poster if anyone wants to chat more. And just some topics that I'll throw out super quick that I would love to talk about is why participants have distinct strategies, if humans, wearable robotics, and robots should handle this the same way, why clinical populations can barely handle 25% of this perturbation magnitude, and why humans prefer multi-step recovery strategies are all things that we're thinking about. So, thank you. I will shout out to my co-authors. Play this in the background during questions. Yeah.
That's pretty insightful. But how do you think that the fact that the preservation was on the threshold, it was, I guess, if I cannot find it's continuously moving, affects the observation in comparison to real life?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So if anyone can hear, the question is how the participant being on a fixed speed treadmill affects their recovery strategy. So that's absolutely a constraint. We've played around a little bit with whether or not we should use a self-paced treadmill that allows them to modulate their speed a little bit. But what we figured out is if you're pitched forward by a perturbation, that's not necessarily, you're intending to speed up in terms of your recovery strategy. So we found a little bit more consistency across people being comfortable and consistent in the way they respond to perturbations with a fixed speed treadmill. And there's definitely some other constraints, like medial-lateral constraints, that are constraining the recovery strategy. But there are a lot of situations, whether it's a hallway or a bus aisle or something, where there are medial-lateral constraints. So that's another one that is definitely a limitation in viewing a completely natural overground recovery strategy that we're thinking about a lot.
Could you clarify, you said that in the second study that you weren't seeing that original strategy as often as you were expecting, but you found a similar one, and you said it might be to do with adaptation. Was it the same participants, or?
No, so they all were new participants, but we did, so the first study we did 288 perturbations, this one we just did 80, and they were consistently pretty large perturbations, and because it was a 50-50 split, they were being exposed to the kind of jump-inducing ones a lot more of the time. So there were some kind of more extreme strategies right at the beginning of the study, but we think people might have gotten used to, the perturbation paradigm a little bit more quickly, despite our best efforts at randomization. Yeah.
Did you look at the timing of the perturbation with respect to the gait cycle and how that may have affected the recovery strategy?
Yeah, so that's one of the variables we control. So we have a closed loop control paradigm that's watching all the markers in real time, calculating gait events, and then targeting single stance and double stance regions. So you have to perturb people at the right time with the right perturbation direction to actually induce this strategy. So you basically hit people with a widening step perturbation at mid or late single stance. They don't have a lot of time to adjust their foot placement, and then they're forced into a narrowing or crossover step in the step after the perturbation. All right, thank you. Oh, Peter.
I don't know if I had a second or not, but I was wondering, the jump is a pretty dynamic thing that requires a lot of power output and stuff. How did the person actually generate that reserve in sort of a short timeline movement to actually execute a jump?
Yeah, so we have inverse dynamics. We haven't gotten to it quite yet. Inverse dynamics on a moving platform is a challenging situation that we're close to completely solving right now. But one of the things that we think is it's not happening on the perturbed step, it is happening on the subsequent step. So there's likely some sort of awareness of kind of the collision that they're approaching before they jump. But it usually takes probably half a step to a full step for them to actually execute the strategy. So that's what I would imagine. Great, thank you.